Welcome to Intention. This is Byron DeLear. This episode has a little of everything. Ken Cox of the business podcast Clicks and Bricks interviewed me with a focus on the holiday for American freedom, Juneteenth. We also talk about our experiences in the music industry, clean energy programs, and the need to advance equity and inclusion to strengthen the American family. So join Ken and me as we explore the power of intention. Let's get started.
Today I bring in my really good friend Byron DeLear, and we're going to talk about Juneteenth. What prompted me to do this is on Juneteenth, one of my really good friends, Brian, posted a comment on how do you celebrate Juneteenth, and I hadn't really thought about it that much at all. 4th of July has always been one of my favorite holidays, celebrating freedom in America and blowing shit up. It's a lot of fun. But I hadn't really considered what Juneteenth meant to me up until that point. And when Brian posted that, I saw some comments that really just kind of pissed me off on that. So I brought Byron in to talk about it because he's a pretty good historian. His resume is stacked. We've been friends for a long time, and I've been looking for a reason to talk to him and have him on the show anyway. So we talk about a whole lot of topics, but the specific reason I brought him in is to talk about Juneteenth. And what really struck me, and I'm going to put Juneteenth right up there with one of my favorite holidays, right there next to 4th of July moving forward, because it stands for freedom. And what Byron said in this interview is so very important, that we the people is how we start our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution. And if it's not we the people, isn't include all of the people, what the hell is it good for, right? So this show is really just me and a good friend of mine hanging out, talking about our past, talking about America, and talking about freedom as a whole. And it was a whole lot of fun for me, and I hope you enjoyed as well.
Welcome to Clicks and Bricks Podcast. We talk about the entrepreneur mindset.
If you get one shot at this, what kind of shot are you going to take?
If we forget who we are, they're going to forget who you are.
And you've got an adversity story that's out of this world.
Everything from that Main Street brick and mortar to that billion-dollar manufacturer.
Do you want to tell the story on how we met? Or would you like me to tell it?
Well, you can start it and I can play Phil.
Okay, so and I'm fuzzy with dates. I have a really bad concept of time in general. So I think it was before my son was born. So it was about 12 years ago. And I was running for city council in Maryland Heights, and you were running for state rep.
Right.
We did not know each other at that point at all. And I just reached out, and I was just reaching out to all the candidates that were running that year, trying to get support however I could. Reached out to you, and I think we had a couple beers and lunch over at Trainwreck Saloon.
Trainwreck, right.
And you were running
Westport Plaza.
I think you were running for state rep at that time.
State representative, correct. Okay. So it probably would have been 2010.
Right. Oh, yeah, right around there. My son is born in 2011, so that would have been 2010. And we learned a lot about each other in that first lunch that we actually had. I don't know that we crossed paths, but we definitely had a similar, we worked for the same company, Suburban Noise, at one point.
Yeah.
Or you sold some music to Suburban Noise. I'm not sure what that was.
Well, I was in a former life, I was a record producer,
right,
and a singer and a songwriter and a recording engineer and an orchestrator, arranger. And I had worked with this group called Double Freak. I was living in Los Angeles at the time. And Double Freak was headed up by Brad X, Brad Xavier. And what they featured was like a white blonde rapper, and then this brunette kind of George Michael crooner. Okay, and that was the Double Freak, right?
Right. Okay.
And so I'd produced them a little bit, and in fact, Eazy-E was interested in signing them at one point, and Eazy-E came over to my studio, and we were listening to tracks and things like this, and that never moved forward. But eventually, Brad found these two rappers, Saint Dog and D-Loc, who were from Riverside area, which is Los Angeles suburb, and they were 19-year-old kids, pretty good rappers, skateboard kids,
right.
And they formed a band called Cottonmouth, and the name then quickly became Cottonmouth Kings, because they found out that Cottonmouth was taken already. It was trademarked by some some random heavy metal band, right?
I did not know that.
Yeah, so the Cottonmouth Kings, and we did some demo masters. Recorded them in my studio, Life Ain't What It Seems, Planet Budtron, Big Hoss, Skate, and they were able to take those demo masters and get a label deal.
Right.
with Capitol Records, which eventually those records turned into Royal Highness, was their debut album.
Did that go gold?
I think it went gold.
I think it went gold.
Yeah, and Suburban Life was on that record.
Right.
As well, which was, I think, in one of the Scream soundtrack films.
I think it was in the first Scream soundtrack.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So Cottonmouth was an interesting experience. I had been producing a lot of different musical styles at that time. You know, I'd produced Warren Hill as a sax player.
Mm-hmm.
I produced dance remixes for Miami Sound Machine, Ace of Base. So what I totally liked about that.
That's a pretty drastic difference.
Yeah. Yeah. No, Warren Hill was those records were charting contemporary jazz records.
Right.
And I wound up having a song off of Warren's first album called Waiting for Love that turned into a top 30 single with a music video and the whole schmear. You know, what I really appreciated about those days was being able to work in so many different creative environments.
Right.
And when you're a producer, you know, you either are hand-holding artists or you're kind of acting like a mentor. You know, like if I were to produce a band like R.E.M. or something like this, I would be more of a sound guy, more of a mentor type of a person. Right. If you're producing sort of, you know, entertainer types that aren't necessarily musicians as their core skill set, then you're showing up with a lot of the music and a lot of that content.
Okay.
And but that was it was so amazing to me that I'm sitting in Trainwreck Saloon, Trainwreck.
Yeah, Trainwreck Bar and Grill or something
Bar
like
and Grill.
Yeah.
And Ken Cox is sitting there, and you go, "Yeah, I road managed Cottonmouth Kings."
I was their stage manager.
I was like, "What?"
Stage manager for a while.
I was like, "What?"
Yeah,
that was incredible. That was
so I lived on the bus with them for a summer. It was I don't know how long it was. It was pretty wild. I know we made from DC to Nashville before I got fired. Yeah. I did get fired from that. Well, I got removed from that tour. And they tried to put me on, because I worked for the record label, not for the band. Right. And they were going to give me another tour, but it was going to be in Japan for a year. And I'm like,
I remember.
And then I went into IT from that.
I remember taking a couple months break off of the music industry, and Passport Entertainment inquired about bringing me back in to run their studios, and we were doing documentaries for PBS, like The Remarkable 20th Century was a 10-hour documentary hosted by the venerable Howard K. Smith, and I did the music and the mix and stuff on those. We did 10 hours of Elvis, called the complete Elvis or something like this. 10 different hours. You know, The Many Loves of Elvis was an hour. Elvis and the Memphis Mafia. Elvis and the Hollywood Years Part 1. Elvis and the so we did all these different shows. But I remember coming back to Hollywood, and Royal Highness had been out for a year at that time, and they had a gig at Avalon, which was right across the street from Capitol Records. That space has been named different club names over the years. I think it's Avalon now, but they were playing there, and this was an 18 and over show.
Okay.
So this wasn't a
21
and over show, and so I came to the show, and I'm sitting on the floor. And all of a sudden, these songs came on that I wrote in my bedroom, like "Life Ain't What It Seems."
Right.
And the whole crowd is up there with lighters and just going nuts. And that was just a really cool feeling, you know, to produce stuff, and you come up with it. You come up with these ideas that gestate, they get some wind behind them, and they go out there and they replicate like your little children, you know, like little babies. And so that was kind of a out of body experience right there.
Yeah. So we could talk all day about the past and the music industry, and I loved it. Everything I do at some point almost takes my life, and the music industry, it definitely took its toll on me for sure. Before I got out of it, there's no doubt about that.
Me too.
But can you tell us a little bit about? So your resume is stacked pretty deep, right? Lots of different stuff, a lot of political stuff, a lot of entertainment, X-Files, X-Men, all kinds, all over the board. But can you tell us a little bit about why I called you today? And today's episode, just to be totally frank, is going to be talking about small business impact and what does Juneteenth mean for leaders, bosses, how should they be interacting with this, all of these things. And, you know, I was looking through who could I bring in to talk about this. And today is actually June 20th, but this episode is going to release, I think, June 25th.
Right.
So we're going to edit it and get it all out, but we're going to go quick because I think this is an important topic for people to know about and be able to talk about. But can you tell us, the reason I called you is because I know that you wrote a significant piece on the United States of America, specifically that term, and you're a history buff and you go back, and I know you do deep dives into all this. Can you tell the audience a little bit more about what the United States of America is and what that is about?
Yeah, sure.
Because I don't want to misrepresent what you do.
Yeah. So I wrote a book, a peer-reviewed history book called The First American Flag, about the Revolutionary War era. And like you said, I mean, if you are an amateur historian, it's incumbent upon you to do a deep dive and to look at source material, primary source material. And if you have any particular motivation to, share your thoughts or views about any period in history, it's also, you're obligated to make sure that you cite those primary sources which are leading you to come to those conclusions. And so my book is chock-a-block with references and citations. And during the time, I actually discovered the first documentary phrase of the United States of America.
Right.
And this was written by a gentleman named Stephen Moylan, Esquire, who was the Muster Master General to the Continental Army. He was, a sort of acting aide-de-camp to General Washington at the time. And this discovery was covered by Christian Science Monitor and NBC News and a bunch of different venues when I made the discovery in 2013. And if you look in Wikipedia under a little-known entry called United States,
right? Okay.
If you look in the 6th paragraph there under etymology, I wrote pretty much most of that paragraph, and it has all the citations about this discovery. But Juneteenth, if you don't mind fast-forwarding to Juneteenth, and I'd love to come back to the Revolutionary War if we can, because that was really my field of study and my focus for a while. But Juneteenth is short for June 19th, and it's a day when a Union general went into Galveston, Texas, and I believe it was Galveston, Texas.
I recall it being
and the Emancipation Proclamation had been issued for 2 years prior, and yet slavery was still standing in Texas. And so he decided to issue an edict or an order mentioning that the executive of the United States has issued this proclamation that all slaves are free. And so Juneteenth really commemorates the tearing down of one of the most destructive institutions in our recent, multi-century memory as a species.
Right.
But also for the history of the United States. Slavery is a huge issue. There were over 600,000 casualties in the Civil War. Here in Missouri, some of the craziest battles were fought in Missouri. There was a thing called General Order 11, which was down by Joplin and Springfield, where they basically said everybody has to leave this whole area, and if you're caught here, we're going to use scorched earth policy to get you out. Just really intense warfare, like what's going on in Ukraine right now.
Yes.
That happened here in Missouri. That happened all across the United States. So we've been inured to the lack of physical violence in our homeland at that scale.
Right.
But
luckily we haven't had it in a very long time in our country.
Right.
It was here, and this is a significant day. So, and I scratch my head, right? And I've got, friends of all different nationalities, and I get a little frustrated. Like my neighbor, I was talking with him, and he's like, I asked him what they're doing for 4th of July. He's like, oh, I don't celebrate that anymore. I celebrate Juneteenth. And then I scratch my head. I'm like, well, without the 4th of July, you don't have Juneteenth, right? So it's frustrating to me. And he's, he kind of played it off like, well, that's your holiday and this is my holiday, and that's to me is just so non-American that we should celebrate both of them and lift both of them up. But I was scratching my head.
I would tend to agree with that. But I would also want to be respectful with how people want to celebrate their sense of America.
Right.
And for African Americans, the fact that several of our founders owned slaves, that's a tough road.
Tough pill to swallow.
That's a tough road to hoe.
Yeah.
And us as white guys, we think about George Washington and these paragons of of democracy and Republican, small
Right.
r republicanism, representative government, the rights that were expressed by Jefferson, building off of John Locke and other English thinkers at the time. In many respects, the revolution was built off of the English Civil War that happened years earlier. We think about these guys as being real visionaries
Right.
and progressive. Because to say the king ain't wearing no clothes, that was progressive.
Right.
That was very, very progressive. Ben Franklin wanted libraries so that poor folks could have access to books
Right.
and learning. These were revolutionary ideas, right?
Yes.
Madison says that knowledge will forever be superior to ignorance, and if a people intend to be their own self-governors, they must wield the power that knowledge brings. So there's this spirit of science and discovery and enlightenment that is woven through the fabric of the foundation of this country.
Right.
And what was fascinating in my research was I was reading all the primary sources between the American generals, the Americans that were writing, and I was reading all the British primary sources as well.
Okay.
And there's a different attitude. There's definitely a new nation that was being birthed. It was a utilitarian nation. It was a nation of can-do spirit. It wasn't something that was, obsequiously prostrating yourself before the king. When you hear these people writing the lords and the kings about the what's going on in the colonies, there's this obsequious, bent knee quality to it.
Right.
And in America, we like the mavericks. We
Yes.
like the independents. We like the entrepreneurs. And that was just as present back then as it is today. So I agree with you that having a holistic appreciation for those innovations that the Revolutionary era brought,
Right.
and understanding that there were inherent flaws,
Absolutely.
like slavery,
Big one.
and it was resolved. But
It took some time.
in the 100 years after the Civil War,
Right.
we still have deep segregation, deep Jim Crow laws. And until the Voting Rights Acts of the 60s, in some sense, it's not that unfair to suggest that we really didn't have a democracy yet, because there was still such a
Right.
sense of disenfranchisement for large swaths of the population. And if you're going to be somebody that says that people are people and that they should have agency, whether you're white or black or woman or a man,
Right.
then it's not that unfair to suggest that our democracy took on a new birth in the 60s, when all of a sudden you have the Voting Rights Act and these different massive pieces of legislation that enfranchised people to be able to have their voice heard. I'm doing a lot of work on that right now I'm vice president of social impact for a company called Y Green Energy Fund.
Okay.
And we have, it's a super company. We have deployed about 2.7 billion in capital for sustainability property improvements and resiliency property improvements among about 115,000 projects in 3 states,
Okay.
California, Missouri, and Florida. And
And these are all energy initiatives.
these are energy efficiency upgrades. I understand you have a new solar system on
I'm
top
installing
of here.
solar right now. Yes.
It's very good.
Should go live in, I think, 2 weeks. It'll be live.
Straight up solar.
Yes.
I know the company very well. They've been a part of the PACE program, which I administer and have designed here in the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County for many, many years. Part of the work that I'm spearheading is helping to solve access to capital issues and problems that have lasted for decades, that have plagued the underserved communities of color. And it all goes back to slavery and the Civil War. And so in some ways, to conclude this, little section, in some ways we're still playing out these struggles and trying to get equal access to opportunities,
Right.
and value for our American citizens.
Right. And that's the difference. In this country, everybody can fight for what they want, but there's an equity problem still, that we're not, not everybody really is playing on the same field. And I think gerrymandering or redlining just recently became illegal, right? Like in the last decade?
Yeah, so redlining is a huge issue. And
right. It's bad. It's really bad when you start learning about it.
I wanted to unpack this because there's a lot of politics that fly around. If you happen to be on the right wing, a Republican, listen to Fox News or something, you're kind of thinking, well, reverse racism exists now. Like whites are being denied. Whites are being denied to go to Harvard because they're white. You hear these kind of things. Yes. And on the left, there are extreme positions as well. But if you just take it from the position from like a typical family, so what happened was we had the Great Depression in 1929, 1930, and the government took on broad stroke measures to try to edify and shore up the housing market. And the government, started what could be said as socialist projects like the Hoover Dam, like for example. During that time, there were some government agencies, federal agencies, that commissioned about 250 maps to be drawn up of all the cities. And those maps graded neighborhoods as either first grade, second grade, third grade, or fourth grade. The fourth grade neighborhoods were red. They were called undesirable, and they basically were indicted as being not worthy of investment and populated by people that were unbankable.
Right.
The majority of those red neighborhoods were communities of color. And if you then look at what the most successful asset for wealth development is in any family, generational wealth development, it's the ability to own and maintain a home. 90% of the country's wealth development or generational wealth development, being able to pass an asset on to your kids, etc., is from home ownership. And there's lots of studies that show this. So when you have whole communities being written off of the American dream, compounding on the injustices that ran into that from the Civil War and slavery preceding that, you have basically taken whole communities and whole families and made it impossible for them to be upwardly mobile.
It's not that different than the ghettos.
And that's
of Germany.
that's what redlining is. And if you look at those communities that were redlined in the 30s, they're, like you said, ghettos, right? So when you look at those zip codes that were redlined, they are still suffering and going through all sorts of hell because of this policy. And Ta-Nehisi Coates says that redlining basically said that if you're black, you're unworthy of investment. And when you shut off the banks, and you shut off the money, and you shut off the ability to own homes, and you shut off the ability to have access to capital, a whole slew of social defects and negative impacts starts to compound, including increased segregation, lack of education, policing issues, all these kind of things compound. And there's lots of studies. There's a 2020 study by the Chicago Federal Reserve that talks about the ill effects of redlining. So when you hear the term redlining, you're really talking about like soft bigotry in federal policy that's holding whole communities down. And so we have to, me as somebody that is interested in crafting policy that uplifts people, we have to think about reasonable ways to uplift these communities that have been left behind. And one of the ways is the PACE program that I helped design and run through Y Green Energy Fund, because we have a financing product where the terms and rates are the same for everybody. And it's affordable. So if you live in Ladue, which is an affluent area in St. Louis County, your terms and rates are the same as if you live in Wellston, which is a lower income area in St. Louis. And that is not how the banks operate. Here's how the banks operate. If you have a lower credit score, you pay more. You pay a premium. You have higher interest rates. So there's a bunch of studies that show that there are discriminatory attributes and in the algorithms that help generate credit scoring,
Right.
which acts as essentially what I call a red line tax. So if there's ways to reverse this in incremental policies that move the football down, I'm not talking about a Hail Mary pass where you get 60 yards, but if there's ways for you to inch down the football field towards a more equitable ecosystem and an equitable marketplace where opportunities are equal, et cetera,
Right.
then that you should lower your shoulder behind that and go full press,
Absolutely. So, and then wrapping this all around, because I'm not a political show, and this is way out of my comfort zone, even talking anything about this in a public arena, but I think it's important. And I think there is a big impact to businesses, big and small, right? Because 2022 is the first year that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, right? So, and it's one day, it's 365th of the year, right? So it's not that big of a deal.
Right.
We only work 200 days a year anyway, so it's one day out of that, and it's a federal holiday, so not everybody's off of work. But there are things to be considered of, right? The banks are closed, the post office closed. Okay, that's a very small deal, but all across the country right now, you have leaders, bosses, employees that are having this conversation, right? And I know, I grew up in a low-income white community. I don't have to go deep into the kind of people that I grew up around, but I got out at a very young age and saw the world for what it really is.
Where was that?
Arnold, Missouri. So I didn't meet my first black person until I was 16 years old, right? So, and I grew up in a bigoted household, right? There's no doubt about that at all. So I have been insensitive many times in my life, right? And I think the vast majority of white managers, bosses, all that, they don't intend to be racist, but I think they might be insensitive to what's going on. So I want to try to pull out for the small business owner that has some black employees that doesn't understand why this day is important. How does he, work with his staff, employees, or, the black business owner that has white employees that don't understand what's going on? Like, well, why do you get another day? And how we can communicate to each other in a positive way and uplifting each other along the way, instead of, I hear all the time, well, the reverse racism. Well, that's not the conversation that we're having. We can have that conversation too, but this other conversation needs to be had.
Yeah. So I would just rewind you to what we mentioned earlier, which was slavery was a BFD.
Yes.
I mean, it was a big, big, big part of this country's history,
right,
which impacts millions of souls. And Juneteenth is the celebration of the official eradication of slavery.
So after that day, there was no more slavery in the United States?
Well, the Emancipation Proclamation
made it illegal.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, but what I'm saying is that the federal holiday of Juneteenth is celebrating the eradication of slavery in the United States. Well, I'm not saying the federal holiday was the vehicle with which slavery was eradicated. The Great Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, which were passed post-Civil War and one during the Civil War, those speak to codifying the eradication of slavery.
Right.
But Juneteenth is the federal holiday that celebrates the country, this great struggle, this great contest that the country went through, and we are hoping that we're creating a more perfect union by continuing to amend and evolve our system of governance. This is a critical piece of the design of our system of governance, is that the government has the ability to amend itself through the people.
Right.
And it goes right to the Declaration of Independence. Alter or abolish.
Right.
If the governors become destructive of the ends of the people to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then the people have a right to alter or abolish that system of government and find new guardians for their freedom and for their posterity. I mean, this is the concept of the United States government. It's a scientific idea.
Yes.
It's like saying,
look,
this might not work.
This is what we think is the best way right now. And let's take measure in 10 years. Is it the best way? I don't know. Let's change it. If you're a constitutional originalist, you believe in evolving that document.
Absolutely.
Because that's originally in the Constitution, is to evolve it to a higher sense of right, to bringing civilization to a higher ground where more people are treated equally. And, there's a debate about, coercing equality of outcomes versus equality of opportunities. We won't get into that debate.
Right.
But I kind of equate this from my days back in the music industry, Ken.
Okay.
So, when you're doing a production in music, you might have 64 tracks. Back in the day, we would have 2-inch tape machines. We would slave them together with SMPTE time code, and we would have this massive solid-state logic console in front of us with a gazillion knobs. I don't know if you remember the Super Bowl show. Dr. Dre did the halftime show. He opened up the show with a mock-up of a mixing desk, because that was his instrument, right?
Right.
That was his instrument. He was a producer. He was doing records, and you have a gazillion knobs. It's not too hard to know which knobs need to be turned up and which knobs need to be turned down when it comes to issues of equity and disparity in America today. If you just take a moment to look at the scientific studies and looking at the impacts of things like redlining and segregation or unequal health outcomes, it's not too hard to really know which knobs need to be, the mix is messed up. The mix ain't grooving right. So it's low-hanging fruit.
Right.
So, let's put off the debates on nuance, and get to like some really basic things. Like if you're an African American family and someone comes to appraise your house,
right,
and they show up and they say it's worth $600,000, and then you de-blackify the house. You take all the pictures off of the mantle that have black families and you put a white woman there, and another appraiser comes and they appraise the house at $1.3 million.
Yeah, that's weird.
That happens all
the time.
It happens all the time.
Right. But I'll play devil's advocate here.
Yeah, please do.
Right? I want to play devil's advocate.
Please do.
Could that just also be the market? The market is the market buys a more bland house. Right? Less personality in the house. It's a more sellable house. Right? I think that would be the argument from the insensitive appraiser.
So, I see your point, and but it goes right to it goes to the heart of, you talk to folks and they say, I'm not racist. And they believe that. And there's a lot of white folks that say, I'm not racist. They believe it.
I don't believe that I'm racist.
Yeah.
I struggle with it.
But this isn't really the heart of the issue. It's not like a subjective sense of, do I have bad, evil thoughts or something when I see, an African American or black person. Do I have that's not really the thing that is at hand here.
Right.
And you're bringing up kind of an individualized analysis of the appraiser, kind of going by the market and stuff like this. Those are all fair conversations and fair points. What is at hand is what's called institutional or systemic racism, which goes to the heart of like the algorithms that generate credit scores, or goes to the heart of, there's this gentleman that I recently was very humbled and honored to present at NAACP Civil Rights Conference. It
was very recent, right?
In February. Yeah. And one of the gentlemen that we brought in is a gentleman named Andre Perry, a senior researcher with the Brookings Institution. He did a pivotal study in 2018 called The Devaluation of Assets in Black Neighborhoods. And they tried to create this sort of apples to apples comparison of all these different attributes. If a home has access to the same caliber of school, all the different attributes that would affect home values and things like this. And basically they found out that communities of color in general, if you wanted to just kind of take a broad stroke swing at it, they're devalued by like 50% less. All other things being equal. And so
Okay.
all other things being equal, and scientifically through a study to make sure that you're doing apples to apples,
Right.
not rhetoric, not political talking points. This is the Brookings Institution. So,
Right.
I mean, that's a fair point that you made.
So
but I just wanted to say that.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I think that happens sometimes, but I do believe that this is happening on a larger scale. Now, I struggle with these two words quite a bit: systemic and systematic.
Uh-huh.
And what is the difference when you're talking about a systematic racism or systemic racism?
Well, I would say that systemic racism or institutional racism basically means that the infrastructure of society that's been built off of
Right.
a country that
Had
was
some racist
country that was run by
background.
by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. I mean, Catholics were kind of like a second-class citizen in the early days.
Right.
And I find that interesting because, the gentleman that I showed that named the United States of America, Stephen Moylan Esquire, was an Irish Catholic immigrant.
Right.
And here's this guy. And so, as soon as I released this finding, Irish Central and Irish Times, they all start releasing articles on it because they're excited to see an Irish immigrant that
Right.
named the United States of America. But at the time, Catholics were considered,
Well, and Irish Catholics were
Yeah.
pretty bottom bucket, right?
Right,
That's my heritage.
Right. Okay,
So,
very good.
yeah.
Well, you named the country. So systemic would have to do with, not individualized subjective things, but rather
Built into the
it's
system.
built into the system.
Right.
It's kind of like how women were treated over the years. They were discriminated against systemically.
Right. But then systematic, and I know
Systematic, I think, and I'm not,
it's more by there's not a lot of female video games, right? Because they're not, but that leads to a whole nother problem of there's not enough engineering jobs for women because they weren't tinkering with the same kind of stuff that the boys were playing with the video games and playing with the computers and stuff to do their games.
And there is a self-selecting dynamic to what boys like to do, what girls like to do.
Right.
And is it conditioning, or is it, is there some sort of biological component? This gets into areas that are very fraught with passionate opinions. And that's not my field that's not my bailiwick. It's not
Right.
my field. But I know that there are a lot of folks that have got their nose to the grindstone trying to figure this stuff out, and that information's available with that old Googler.
Yes.
I mean, you can chase down very passionate opinions on all sides of that equation. Gender equity. The issue of like a lot of the sensationalist kind of TikToks you see today. We'll have some guy. Well, what is the definition of a woman?
Oh yeah, the gender stuff.
So you have a biological component to this, and then you have the social construct of what it means to be more feminine or masculine or woman or man. And being a 56-year-old white guy, I don't have a lot of experience in this realm. My sister's lesbian. One of my first political experiences was canvassing for the Los Angeles Lesbian and Gay Center to promote, gay marriage. And,
Right.
And so, I support the efforts to uplift marginalized communities. But that's definitely an area that I don't have a lot of expertise in.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of expertise. I'm super fortunate that I own a boxing gym, and I have, I lean in on inclusion, right?
Yeah.
I lean in very big on inclusion and making sure that sport's available to all kinds of different people that wouldn't at normal boxing gyms. So my 350 students are wildly eclectic. They're across the board at every single possible gender, sex, race, everything you can think of. So I get to be embraced with that all the time in this weird little community that I've created.
You were raised in Arnold.
Yes.
And you mentioned that your growing up experience, that you were exposed to bigotry.
Oh, my stepfather was he was flat out racist.
Yeah.
Like openly racist.
So was there some pivotal event in your background that opened your mind to being more empathic or having a sense of empathy about the plight of,
I mean, I'm an empath by nature. right? Just in general. I've blocked it off for most of my life, and it comes back and stuff. But I can say that I'm also wildly dyslexic. So I have a big distrust in everything that comes out of my mind, and a bigger distrust for everybody that puts stuff into my head, just right out of the gate. So I have a curiosity about me that just says, is what I'm hearing true or not? Because I have to do that to myself. Was what I'm seeing true or not? And I got...
so you have a hyper sense of critical thinking going on.
All the time.
From the beginning.
And I got a job. My mom worked for a company called Pope's Cafeteria in St. Louis. And I got a job working there she had moved on, but I worked there for one of her old bosses, right? And I was washing dishes, and the guy that was next to me was a black guy, right? I'm 16 years old, first black guy I ever met in my life, and I'm sitting there working next to him, and I very quickly realized that everything that I'd ever been told about black people was just wrong. Absolutely. By the very first black guy I ever met in my life and talked to, I'm like, everything that I've been told about black people is at least wrong about this guy, right? He's a hard worker. He busts his ass. He's providing for his family. He's working 2 jobs.
Right.
And I grew up, Arnold, Missouri. I grew up in a town called Lower Arnold, which is completely gone now, right? The floods of '93 wiped it all out.
Oh, interesting.
So, 5 kids in an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment, Kool-Aid stains and holes in the walls, right? It was and then we came from South City, from where we're even lower class, right? And then moved to Arnold, in what in St. Louis was white flight time, right? That was another pretty not that great time for the city of St. Louis. So the very first experience that I had with a black person contradicted everything that I'd ever been told.
Right.
So, and if you're familiar with my little town and you're familiar with little towns in general, poor little towns.
I'm familiar with Arnold.
Most people don't ever cross the bridge. Right? Whatever little bridge that you have in your town, most of that community doesn't cross the bridge. And as soon as I crossed that bridge, I realized that everything that I was taught was not accurate. So I stayed on the other side of that bridge as much as I possibly could. And as soon as I was able to get out of it, I did. Right.
Very interesting. I had an experience that I actually shared at the Civil Rights Conference. Because here I'm an older white guy being asked to address the NAACP. Okay, what a value. I can talk about the numbers and the metrics and the percentage of projects that our PACE programs are doing that are completed by minority contractors, and I can cite chapter and verse ad nauseum about all this stuff. But coming from a show business background, I know that in show business and entertainment, what moves people is something that's emotionally impactful, something that is subjective, something that is personal. Okay. And so what I shared was this story that kind of opened my eyes, which was, back when I was 20 years old, living in Los Angeles, someone that had the most privilege and acceptance in society that you can imagine. I was producing an R&B artist named Reliant, and we were doing a mix. And oftentimes back then, what you would do is you would print the mix on a cassette tape.
Yep.
And then you go check out the mix in your car to get a different perspective on it. Because now you got your speakers in your car playing the song, and you can hear what needs to be turned up and what needs to be turned down. Gives you a different perspective, because one of the issues in all entertainment, in all publishing, in all creation, is that you live with something for so long, but one of the skills is trying to retain a first-person perspective about listening to it for the first time. And that's a distinct skill. That's true for movies, it's true for writing, it's true for doing a sculpture,
Website development.
Yeah, everything.
Every website I ever built, I hate by the time I'm done.
Yeah, right. So, in a context of music, you might spend 1,000 hours on a song, and the song lasts for 2 minutes for the normal audience member. So you print the cassette. We printed the song on the cassette. We put it in my car. I had a Honda Civic at the time, and we tooled down the street, down Hollywood, and we parked in front of a 7-Eleven, and we're listening to the mix, taking our notes dutifully. And we got to a place where, let's go back and let's output another mix. I think we've got 10 or 15 tweaks that we want to do.
Right.
So we pulled out of the 7-Eleven, started driving down the street, And about 8 police cars pulled us over with the helicopter flying overhead with the spotlight, and they had their guns drawn. The cops had their guns drawn. They asked me to exit the vehicle and backpedal with my hands on my head and put my face into the pavement and handcuff me. They did the same to Reliant. They searched the car. They did the whole schmear. And after it was all done, I went up to the officer, and I'd gone to military school. I knew what it was like to talk to authority and the chain of command and this kind of, I'd grown up with that. So I went to the officer in charge and I said, what was going on here? Why did you pull us over? And he said, well, we saw a white guy and a black guy sitting in a car in front of the 7-Eleven, not doing anything, and we thought you were casing the joint and was going to commit a robbery. And it was in that instant, that very fraction of a nanosecond, that I knew that the America that I'd been growing up in was not the same America that many other people had grown up in. And that, I knew for a nanosecond what it was like to drive while black, to be black. And later on, when I was doing a radio tour for my song Waiting for Love that I'd sponsored myself, it was a song off of Warren Hill's album. Warren Hill's a sax player, and I sang a song, and it was a top 30 single. But I remember touring all across the United States, visiting about 60 radio stations, driving in a 50 Chevy. And we would cold call stations like in Albuquerque that were reporting stations, and they would put us on the air like only, after meeting us for 10 minutes. I also knew that if I was black, I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have gone around on all these stations and have that kind of access, that kind of acceptance, that there would always be this air of suspicion. I'm reminded of President Obama saying he remembers when he would be walking around in a department store and cops would be following him around the department store, things like that. So that was a pivotal experience for me when I was a young man that really opened my eyes in an empathic way, that the experience of all Americans was not the same as what I had assumed.
Right.
So this is why it's important for a federal holiday like Juneteenth to be accepted into our country, because it's part of our national DNA. The eradication of slavery, the great contest, the great war, the trauma and travail that this nation has experienced and continues to experience to this day with police shootings, George Floyd, Eric Garner, things like this. It's important because it has a healing succor to it, that when you have a federal holiday that is celebrating the eradication of slavery, and it was traditionally an African-American day of celebration, where you had informal ad hoc celebrations occurring over the many decades. But being able to codify it as a national federal holiday talks about an America that's reaching higher ground. It talks about a national family that has a coherent narrative that should be appreciated and recognized. And we've seen how that many monuments to the Civil War and to Confederate generals are being torn down. And the usage of the Confederate flag is being cited for what it really is, which was a symbol of racism. And I used to be editor-in-chief for the National Vexillological Association, NAVA. Vexillology is the study of flags. So I know about the Confederate flag. I know its history. I know what its background is, chapter and verse. And we are tearing down these monuments to traitors to the United States that attempted to destroy the United States in support of slavery. That's what was going on in the Civil War. And they also violated the Constitution in doing it, because the Constitution says clearly states cannot...
We were in literally two different countries at that time.
Well, you cannot have states confederate against the United States. That's illegal constitutionally. So Lincoln fighting to save the Union was constitutionally appropriate. But we're seeing that these monuments are being torn down. We're seeing these flags pulled down. And we're seeing other monuments that are being erected that talk about a unified history, that recognize the plight of African Americans, that recognize our history, that talk about the Union that talk about America,
Right.
American justice, American patriotism. And today they're unveiling a thing at downtown St. Louis called the Freedom Suits Memorial.
Okay.
And there's a very famous case called the Dred Scott case, which went through the St. Louis courts, went through the Missouri Supreme Court, went to the Supreme Court of the United States. And it's famous because the Supreme Court rendered a verdict saying, once a slave, always a slave.
Okay.
It was horrible. Dred Scott was suing for his freedom,
Right.
and he got denied. The Dred Scott case is very famous for this. So they discovered in the basement of the St. Louis courts about 200 or so cases of slaves that were using the justice system, using the courts to sue for their freedom.
And being denied.
Well, yes. And so where we've seen around St. Louis a few Confederate generals and stuff pulled down, well, now a beautiful monument is going up next to the courts called the Freedom Suits Memorial. And this is an American narrative.
Right.
Suing for your freedom. That goes to the heart
Yes.
of what the Revolutionary War was about. Was about having more self-determination and representation and not being denied by a scabby king over in England.
Right.
And
So
so
and I don't have a horse in that rodeo, right? But in my head, I struggle with, they shouldn't be up, but I also know that we're doomed to repeat ourselves if we don't tell the whole history. So part of that, the removing of them completely concerns me a little bit, because I'm afraid that as we remove this part of our history, or not even, we need to keep it. We just don't put it up on display.
Sure.
Right.
So
but how do we remove that?
Yep.
That the display and keep and not go down that same path again.
Absolutely.
Because I think there are powers in this world that want that back still.
It's a valid point. But I think there's a huge distinction between the motivations and the intention of why these monuments were put up. A lot of them happened in the early 1900s.
Right.
And they were attempting to glorify the cause of the South.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it was called the Lost Cause. It's called the Lost Cause mythology, if you want to Google it.
Okay.
And it was basically, so the Civil War happened, and then there was a period of about 10 years following it called Reconstruction, where the South was carved up into 5 military districts. And this is when the Ku Klux Klan came into being. This is when the dark forces started to started to reform in the shadows.
Right.
And but then it was not so much in the shadows anymore, because at some point the military occupation of the South was ended and Reconstruction ended, and that's when Jim Crow and segregation laws came into effect.
Okay.
And Jim Crow basically said, you can't have, you only can have white bathrooms and black bathrooms, and black people can't go vote. And so blacks were denied from the marketplace, they were denied from the ballot box, they were denied from society in general, from politics. And this lasted for 100 years until the Civil Rights era, when more important amendments were passed to help reverse those. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. These are the laws that help to turn injustice into justice for people.
Right.
And, Star Trek. There's an episode.
Okay.
There's an episode where Jim Kirk, the original Star Trek.
Right.
Star Trek of our era, right?
Right.
There's an original episode where they come to this planet, and you have the Kangs, which are supposed to be, or the Yangs and the Koms.
Okay.
And the Yangs are kind of like these brutish, like Viking barbarian kind of guys that are really brutish, and the Koms have somewhat better technology, and there's this massive war going on forever and ever and ever. And at the end, they're using this kind of alien language that's sort of like a lost Latin or something. And Kirk cannot understand it, but he keeps thinking that he can understand it. And at one point, he deciphers it. And he realizes that this society had patterned themselves, for whatever science fiction reason, over the Earth society. And the Yangs was short for Yankee, and the Coms was short for communist. And at that time, they bring out this sacred cloth, and it happens to be this old battered United States flag. And he says that the words that the Yangs were using were secret words that only priests could say. And then Kirk has this, William Shatner has this beautiful monologue where he says, "E plebista, we the people." These are words for everybody.
Right.
And if they're not for everybody, they mean nothing.
Right.
And that's where we are today. We need to take the promise of the Constitution and our sacred founding documents and apply them to everybody. And that really instructs, I believe, how the United States foreign policy should be conducted. Okay. Because there was a time when we supported human rights and we had standing because we walked the walk in addition to talking the talk.
Right.
Things have become more complicated in the last few decades. Mm-hmm. But I believe that should inform how we project ourselves into the world, because there is no better example of the great melting pot of representative democracy than these United States. And if we see a planet coming together that supports human rights, that supports the individual, that supports the ability for self-governance, that is something that looks like what we've got brewing in our cauldron of democracy.
Yeah, the future for our democracy, late stage capitalism, whatever you want to call what we're currently in, it's super exciting, right? As we have more and more automation and robotics and things like that come to play. I think it's horrible, and I say this all the time, right? If you're an American and you want to start a company today, get started. We need more manufacturing in this country. We're still supporting slavery with our products, our services, or not our services so much, but a lot of the products that we're purchasing in our country are still supporting slavery, and it's horrible. And part of my goal is to help more people start businesses, whatever it is, manufacturing in the thing. And I'm a huge fan of small batch manufacturing. I think a lot of people today could take their passion and make $80,000, $100,000, $200,000 a year doing small batch manufacturing with a couple of their family members out of their house. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that micro economics going in our future, right? We've already got the Great Resignation, we've got the side hustle culture, and the on-demand culture of employment, right?
And we're going to be seeing a lot more standard professions being diluted and unpacked by the introduction of artificial intelligence and into our professional classes. I mean, I saw this in the music industry. Mm-hmm. In the music industry, all of a sudden you had drum machines, and drummers were put out of work.
Yep. Bobby B.
And then you had what?
Bobby B was on a drum machine, wasn't he?
Yeah, Bobby B with Cottonmouth Kings. And then synthesizers were able to do polyphony, and so now you had string players put out of business. I was working for 20th Century Fox at a certain point, and I was working in their division, Latin American division, doing the National Geographic Channel for all the Portuguese-speaking world and the Spanish-speaking world, and I was doing Fox Channel for all the Spanish-speaking world, South America, Spain, etc. And we got to a place where our department in Los Angeles was shut down because they could do it in Argentina for 25 cents on the dollar, and maybe they did about 80% of the quality we did. But do the math.
Right.
You're at 25 cents on the dollar, but 80% of the quality. If you're a balance sheet guy, which are the guys that run the companies, then you're out. You're zip. That's it.
Right.
So we had layoffs there. You're going to see millions of trucker jobs eliminated shortly with robots on the roads, right? Robot cars on the roads. So I believe that this micro economy, this thing that you're discussing, where we have a sort of a decentralization a de-urbanization that occurs that's facilitated by information technology, but also lifts up these communities of interest locally. And one of the fascinating things about energy efficiency measures is that 90% of the products in energy efficiency, that's insulation for your homes, that's heating and cooling systems, are manufactured in the United States.
Oh, really?
90%.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's
insulation,
phenomenal.
roofing, stuff like that.
Right.
So, local economies is absolutely critical. I can remember, I went through a merger and acquisition with my company. We had my dear friend Tom Applebaum, who you met back in 2010 as well.
Yep.
Tom's an attorney for St. Louis County. We had a company called Energy Equity Funding.
Okay.
And so we were program administrators for this policy called PACE policy, and we were doing energy efficiency and renewable energy upgrades on commercial properties. One of our big projects was a $2.5 million energy efficiency upgrade on the Missouri Athletic Club in 2015. And Mayor Slay, the mayor of St. Louis, came out and did a big press conference and everything, and we about this, the importance of property owners in the area to participate in these public-private partnerships, these programs. When I had energy equity funding, we sold it to Y-Green in 2017, and where Y-Green is the company I work for now. We were able to take an idea from its start, and for many, many years, we were not making enough money to put bread on the table.
Right.
But we were indefatigable. We were tireless, and we kept at it. And then by about year 4 or 5, that's when we started to see the corner turn. And so I'll say that if you're bringing value to your community, if you're improving people's lives,
right,
and you're passionate about it, then stick with that.
Yes.
Because that's a legacy that has legs.
And that, to me, comes right down to, I talked about this with a lot of people, is do what you love and you'll never work a day in your life. And people don't understand really what that means, right? And that's what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Is find it. And I promise you, if you can figure that out, the money will figure itself out, right? You'll make enough to live. You'll figure out how to get bread on the table somehow. I'm not exactly sure how it all works, connected to the universe and all that fun stuff, but I can tell you when your mind's in the right spot and you're doing the stuff that you love to do, that everything else just starts to really fall into place.
Well, I listen to some sports talk folks every once in a while, and Colin Cowherd, has his, I think that's his name, Colin Cowherd. He's got a sports show, and he was talking about the great athletes and their careers. And he said that these great athletes, that the difference between greatness and just being run-of-the-mill or average is a matter of points and seconds.
Yes,
and he identified all these different instances. LeBron in 2016 when he beat Golden State Warriors when he was down 3-1, whatever. He identified all these different instances, and it came down to just a matter of a few points on the board, a few seconds. And so to speak to, you don't know how the universe works and how this all comes together or whatever, but if you are passionate about what you're doing,
right,
then you're going to go into a sort of a state of subconscious execution. And that puts an extra couple points on the board.
Yes.
Because you're not belaboring, you're not in the middle of a drudge task list.
Yes.
You're not, because you're enjoying yourself.
And you don't quit when it gets tough.
This is what you love. And you're more carnivorous. Well, maybe that's the wrong word. You're more aggressive to find the solution.
Yes.
Because you're protecting your love.
Yes.
You're protecting your life and your love. And so it's just a question of a few points or a few milliseconds. And that's the importance of being passionate about what you do. And that's a big differentiator for sure.
Very, very big. I know that I've failed at so many things that, like, I can do this because it'll make money. But I didn't really love it And yeah, it made money, but it didn't have legacy behind it, right? It was just, this is what I'm doing right now.
So what's on your horizon? I mean, I come to this office you've got this amazing sound stage here, and you've got this podcast that's just been picked up by a couple of venues. I hope you don't mind if I flip the interview.
No, not at all.
And you've got, you just put a solar system up there.
Right.
I just toured your data room.
Yep.
You were into cryptocurrency.
Yes.
You've got all this stuff going on. What's exciting you? What are you loving right now?
So right now, I mean, I'm loving doing the show, and just because I get to talk to so many business founders on a daily basis, and the opportunities that have been awarded to me by doing this show have just been outstanding, right? I'm not traveling like I was back when I was a kid, but at least once a quarter I get to travel. I'm going to Freedom Fest next month. I just spent a week in San Diego, a week in Orlando. I'm going back to Orlando for Funnel Hackers next in September. I tell this story quite a bit. When I was a kid, I grew up. My mom was homeless when I was born. I grew up in the back of bars. My mom worked at bars, worked her way up, got a job at WashU finally. All of this, my mom and stepdad would sit on the couch and they would talk about all these ideas that they had, these businesses that they wanted to open, right? And for me, I started my first business in high school, vending machines, right into my first production company, shooting videos, working for myself. And I know my dad was always super nervous. Like, well, how are you going to eat? Who's going to pay you? I'm like, well, that's on me to figure out, man.
Right.
I got to sell this stuff, right? That's on me. And this is what you mom talk about all the time, but you don't do it. My dad was a racist drunk, violent man, right? But
sorry to hear that, man.
This is my stepdad. 2 years before he passed away, he started his business. And he quit drinking that year. He quit smoking. And I think it was the happiest 2 years of his entire existence. It's the time that we actually started getting along for those last 2 years of his life. And he died 2 years later, right? So
that's a life lesson, right?
And if I can get anybody that's sitting on their couch today, right, to get up and actually just start doing the work, build the website, get the LLC, talk to the lawyer, whatever it is, then I think I've won, right? I've done a justice to the world that's bigger than I can ever be. Through this journey, I've had my alcohol issues and all that other stuff. About 7 years ago, I almost lost my life again to alcohol. My liver was almost in cirrhosis. I had to quit drinking, all those things. So, and I see a lot of business owners stuck at that. They just took a giant hit and they turn to the wrong things. And if I can help somebody that's in that boat, then that's another one. So I just look at this show as a way to do all of those things under one format, and I couldn't be happier doing it.
That's great, man.
So, and along the way, if anybody needs IT services of any kind, I'm a broker for every, AT&T, Verizon, every single internet provider in the world.
Got St. Louis Public Library back there.
Yeah, I have St. Louis Public Library, some airports, some hospitals. If you need any help with IT along the way, I'm happy to do that. But luckily for me, I'm a privately held company. My shareholders are amazing.
Yeah.
I don't have to answer to the stock market, so we can do things a little differently, more of a concierge service.
Well, I find it, interesting, Ken, that you called me because it just so happens that D-Loke from Cottonmouth Kings had contacted me recently because he was listening to one of the songs we did, Planet Budtron.
Right.
which
out of everybody in the band, D-Loke and I got along with D-Loke the best.
Yeah.
He was very down-to-earth
He's
kid.
super. He's super. So, back then in 97, a song named Planet Budtron, that was crazy.
Oh, yeah.
That was crazy.
Yes.
But so he's actually doing some work with a guy named Shifty, who is the singer for Crazy Town.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember that song called Butterfly.
Yeah, a little bit,
Come, my lady, come,
Yes.
my pretty lady, you're my that was a huge hit. It's got like 200 million views on YouTube, right?
Yep.
So we're going to be doing some production and some music together. So
Nice.
I get to kind of rewind the clock and do something that one of my original loves,
Nice. I don't know that I'm gonna go back in the music industry. Well,
I might drag you back in.
Well, that was a bump in the road for me.
One thing I am going to do
Yeah.
is when this is published, I'm going to send it to D-Loc and go, look, there's these two Cottonmouth King guys that got together.
Yeah. So music was an accident for me. I was in film school. And literally I transferred from WashU to Webster. And I did one day, and I was a producer on a piece of crap short film. I got 3rd place in Kansas Film Festival, and I was working on a movie called Arcade Bowl. I don't even know if it ever got out of post-production, right? Here in St. Louis. I just transferred to Webster University. It was my first day at Webster. I get home from school. I'm on my way home. I stop at Applebee's for a little vodka and orange juice is what I drank back then. And I was sitting there, and I volunteered on every single stage I could possibly do. My internship was at the Kiel Center. I was Mississippi Music Festivals all the time. Anytime I could be on a stage, I volunteered or got paid. However, if I could be on a stage, I was on a stage. It didn't matter. I knew that my camera career was over because I had gotten a bad car accident and my shoulders were gone. So I knew I wasn't going into video anymore. So I was directing, producing, that kind of stuff. I walk into Applebee's and my buddy Travis, who was their sound engineer, he says, hey, I saw you at Mississippi Music Festival. You know how to manage stages and stuff, and you do the Kiel. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, we have a stage manager job open. Do you want it? And I'm like, what's it pay? Blah, blah, blah. I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. When does it start? And he goes, tomorrow. Now, mind you, I'm working at WashU full-time making medical videos. I just started Webster that day, and I called my mom. I'm like, hey, I just got this job opportunity. I don't know what I should do. And I told her the details. She goes, well, you're never going to get this opportunity again.
Right.
You got to go.
Right.
So
I never went on tour with those guys. But
it was an experience like, you know, to give you. So we're on tour with Cottonmouth Kings, Funk Junkies, Insane Clown Posse, and then Gore enters the tour near Halloween that year.
Mm-hmm.
So,
ISP are pretty nuts. They have this whole
they're business guys.
What is that cult? The tribe?
Juggalos.
Juggalos.
Yeah, they built a cult.
I was actually doing some songs with Pakalika. He's about the 6'7" skinny guy that did pop locking and dancing.
Yeah, he's in the Janet Jackson video.
Yeah, he's in the Janet Jackson. He would wear a gas mask and crazy stuff on stage and like a pimp fur coat.
Yeah,
and
super nice kid.
Super
nice guy.
Great guy, yeah.
Yeah, so it was just a blast. So
yeah, time flies, you know.
Yeah, it does. And that was a very unique part of my life and an experience that not many people get to have. I learned a ton. ICP was all about selling merch, right?
Yeah.
We make our songs. This is how we sell our merch, and we sell lots and lots of merch.
So I'd like to just reflect on one of the things you said about people in the audience, people that are listening to the show. Mm-hmm. that listen to your bricks and clicks, right?
Clicks and bricks.
And I have a YouTube channel, Intention with Byron DeLear. It's called Intention. Okay. It's a podcast. It's available where podcasts are heard, as well as on YouTube. And I recently interviewed the former advisor to President Zelensky. President Zelensky of Ukraine, mm-hmm. right when the Ukrainian war started. His name was Igor Novikov. That got some like 37,000 views, and I did a few shows on UFOs.
Yes.
A gentleman named Lou Elizondo who ran the Pentagon's secret UFO program, and I was able to get an interview with him, and we produced a lot of different content with the video and things like this. But you're talking about people that are potentially at a plateau, or they're stuck mm-hmm. in their business plan or their enthusiasm about what they're doing.
Correct.
And you mentioned that if there's anything you can do to help somebody get off their couch, you talked about your father, how he finally started his business, he quit smoking, he quit drinking, and then he passed on a couple of years later, which mm-hmm. is a tragedy.
Yeah.
I would just suggest to the audience, one of the most important things about lubricating your chops to be able to market yourself and to get a business going is through the use of language and the use of presentation skills. Mm-hmm. And so being able to listen to podcasts and listen to how people express themselves, like this conversation has tiptoed and bounced around a lot of different topics in a sort of a serendipitous fashion, right? Being able to listen to podcasts, and if you hear a turn of phrase that you think resonates with you or that moves you, stop the tape, rewind it, listen to that turn of phrase, repeat it, and get it into your own mouth.
Right.
Get it into your own ability to express yourselves, and then apply it to what you're doing. And in essence, it's kind of like, I mean, again, I'll just bring it back to music. You know, the language of business, the language of marketing is a series of riffs and ideas and concepts that you string together to tell your story.
Yep.
And storytelling and narrative is absolutely critical to getting the ball down the field, to moving something. And so I applaud you for offering that to folks, and that's a real pure motivation. And what are you doing? You're improving people's lives.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I sure hope so.
Yeah.
Yes. So, Byron, thank you so much for joining us today. I very much appreciate it. I appreciate all the words of wisdom. I have a gift for you.
Oh, you do?
I do. I know you're an IPA guy.
Okay.
For sure, but I also think you're a whiskey.
Oh, wow.
I think you're a Scotch guy.
Yes, very
there
good.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. I had a blast talking with you, and I'm sure we'll talk again. I would love to pick your brain on UFOs at some point.
Oh, yes, sure.
But I think it's a whole different.
Oh, absolutely.
Entirely different.
Yeah, there's quite a few different topics we could touch on, and we just kind of, did the greatest hits today. But
awesome.
I think that our background together in the music industry, I'm definitely going to share this interview with D. Loke.
Absolutely, and if he's up for it, I'll fly out to LA and we'll have a couple drinks at the Viper Room if he's up for it.
So. That place used to be called The Central.
Okay, yeah.
And I remember I was in a battle of the bands there with a group called Chrome Display. It was a trio. I was the guitarist.
Right.
And we won the battle of the bands there when it was called The Central.
My very first TV show ever was a show called The Edge in St. Louis. And we were TCI Cable, if you remember that, before Charter and all that stuff. And me and a girl, Marshall Fair, she's in a TV show called LA Nights, I think, that shot out of Canada. Her husband is Tommy Black, and he runs the Viper Room now.
Oh, wow.
So
very good.
I get pretty good treatment if I fly out there and stop by there. So
well, I'll buy the plane tickets.
We're still really good friends, and we still get to talk. And unfortunately, I was just in San Diego, and we had planned to get together, but she was sick, so I didn't get to go up there and enjoy the night. But anytime that he extends the invite, I'm there.
That sounds great.
Fantastic. Thank you, Byron.
All right.
Have a great day.